We're going to finish up our discussion of international law by talking about international ethics, which is a massive topic, and we're really not going to do it justice. But I'm going to talk about three important perspectives on international ethics. Let's start just by answering the question, what is ethics? And a simple definition is that ethics are the moral principles that govern behavior or the conduct of some activity. And so we often talk about ethics in some particular realm, so now we're talking about ethics in international politics. Ethics answers the questions, what is the right thing to do in some situation or in some field of activity? And in some respects, there's like two different versions of it, right? One is, what are the things that's unacceptable? What are the things you're not allowed to do? And at the other end of the spectrum is, what are the things that you have to do, right? So for example, in the case of international politics, chemical weapons, the using chemical weapons is seen as unacceptable under all circumstances. And similarly, when genocide is happening somewhere in the world, there's a belief, and actually a treaty that says so, that other states are required to intervene, right? So that's an ethical and legal principle. So to be clear then, what we're talking about when we talk about ethics is we're talking about the should. And that really is a shift from what we've been doing most of the quarter. Most of the quarter, we've been avoiding kind of the what should happen questions or what should be done, what should the world look like, to asking the questions, what does the world look like, how does it actually work? Well, now we're really getting into the question of how things should look. So let's be clear about that distinction. Is international ethics an oxymoron? A lot of people are going to say so. And this then essentially is the realist position, and that's the first of the three positions I want to introduce. Going all the way back 2,500 years ago, Thucydides quite eloquently wrote, saying basically, when it comes to questions of right and wrong, it doesn't matter, right? All that matters is who's got the power. And his point was not actually that there is no such thing as ethics, but that there's no international ethics. Right? There's no shared obligations between states. States have obligations internally because they are a single political community. So the notion is that outside of a shared community, there are no ethical obligations. Machiavelli made much the same point, which is he had a clear sense of ethics and of obligation, and the point that he made was that any given state has a powerful obligation to do what's best for its own people. Right? And to the extent that doing good things for others around the world comes at the expense of one's own people, Machiavelli would say that that's unethical, especially if it leads to a disaster for your people. So this really gets us to a focus on national interests as the core of ethics in politics. The realist position on ethics is often identified with the idea that the end justifies the means. This idea that if you get the result that you want, it doesn't matter if you had to do unethical things to get there, right? As long as the result is less damaging than the means, right? So here are some examples. The law of war. Well, there is law of war, and realists are going to say you should follow the law of war when it's in your interest to do so, but when it's not, right, have at it. You don't owe it anything to people that you're at war with, right? What you owe is to your own people to win the war. And you owe it to your own soldiers to get as few of them killed as possible, right? And so anything you do in terms of the law of war that decreases your chance of winning or gets more of your own people killed, realists would say is unethical. Same thing with torture. Realists would say if torture is not ethical, they're not going to say torture is ethical, but they're going to say if torture is in your country's interest because it helps you capture terrorists or win a war because you've tortured somebody into giving away important information, then they would say that's justified. Similarly, drones. Drones to realists are just another means of war. Have at it. Human rights. Realists are going to say human rights in other countries are not your problem, right? The job of a government has an obligation to its people. It has no obligation whatsoever to people in other countries. So the attitude towards intervention is the notion of humanitarian intervention for realists is it's basically the null set. We're never, ever required or obligated to intervene to prevent horrible things happening to other people. That's not the job, realists will say. On the other hand, realists will say, if it's somehow in our country's interest to intervene in some other country, Realists would say, go ahead and have at it. Perfectionism is the second school that I want to talk about, and it's almost the opposite of realism. The position of perfectionism is that ultimately the goals that you're trying to get at can be undermined if you use unjust means to get them, right? Or in other words, it's unjust and counterproductive to use unjust means to a just end. The classic example of this in politics is the policy of nonviolent resistance followed by Martin Luther King Jr. In the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and by Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian independence movement. And so in both cases, King and Gandhi in their own way said, we want to change, we basically want to fight against very, very powerful actors who are being pretty brutal to us, but we're not going to use violence against them. We're going to retain the moral high ground, in part because of what it does to us if we start becoming violent. But they also both argued that it was more effective. And it's worth pointing out that King in the Civil Rights Movement was able to make great progress against a very powerful and very determined resistance. And of course, Gandhi was able to help prize the Indian subcontinent away from what at the time was still the world's most powerful global empire. So perfectionists, one of the things they're going to point out is these means are not necessarily ineffective. Now, realists will have a response to that, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. So perfectionism applied. There aren't a ton of examples in international politics, but there are some. The notion of responsibility to protect, which is discussed in the textbook, that's a kind of a classic perfectionist argument, which says there are some situations in some places and sometimes that are so bad that not only is it okay for foreign countries to intervene to solve a problem, but in fact, they are required to do so. They are ethically obligated to intervene to solve certain problems. So think about starvation or genocide. The intervention in the UN intervention in Haiti at various points in time, especially after the earthquake in 2000, I think it was 2010, are good examples of this. Simply, we can't not do something. That's often the logic in cases of disaster relief and famine relief. A really important example of this quite recently is Germany's refugee policy in 2015 and since then. Right, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of refugees flowing out of the Middle East, largely as a result of the Syrian conflict, but also other conflicts in that region, and basically piling into Europe, trying to get to Germany, and Germany, the German government basically saying, you know, we're the ones who caused a lot of humanitarian disaster earlier in the 20th century. We have a special obligation, and while it's going to cause a lot of problems for us, we're simply going to open the door and let them all come in. And they did. And it has created created economic problems. It's led to the rise of a far-right party in Germany that's been opposed to this refugee policy. But of course, it's also helped hundreds of thousands or millions of people escape violent conflicts and get a shot at a decent life. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel at the time, famously said, we can do this. And essentially, she was also saying, we can't not do this. So there are examples. And that's a big, important, recent example. Nonperfectionism is a kind of a medium in-between position. It says morality matters, but it recognizes that these situations can get pretty tricky. Right? The idea is that sometimes doing the ethical thing can lead to bad outcomes. Or sometimes doing something unethical can lead to a result that's better overall. So the real point I want to make about non-perfectionism is not just that it's a compromised position, but that it's a very nuanced and complex position. It's not just wishy-washy, but it is, I think, a tricky one to really wrap your head around because of its position on the ethics of really difficult situations. So a classic case is about torturing suspected terrorists. When is it okay to torture somebody? Right? Perfectionism is going to say torture is always bad, full stop. And essentially, that was the position of the United States government all the way up until 2001. Torture is bad, full stop, don't do it. well, you get to this case of where you think you've captured a terrorist who might know where there are other terrorists, right? People start saying, wait a second, right? So the textbook case is, what if you capture a terrorist and you know that he knows where there's a bomb planted that's going to kill a bunch of innocent people, right? And you believe that by torturing him, you could get him to tell you where the bomb is and save a bunch of innocent people. Is it really ethical not to torture somebody when not torturing that person is going to lead to a whole bunch of innocent people getting killed? The non-perfectionists are going to say, in that situation, right, it's probably better to torture one person than to have a whole bunch of innocent people killed. But they're going to say, right, that doesn't mean that it's not unethical. It just means it might be the least bad policy. There's a whole series of cases and examples about this notion of when is it acceptable to do something bad. And it goes under the name, funnily enough, of trolley car ethics. And the reason it's called trolley car ethics is there's a whole set of examples with different nuances to them that start with this famous hypothetical example where there's a trolley car running out of control and it's going to kill a bunch of innocent people, but by throwing one person in front of the trolley car, you can stop the trolley car. And right, the question is always do you throw one person under the trolley car, one innocent person under the trolley car, in order to save innocent people? If you're interested in this, there's a great PBS series by a Harvard ethicist named Michael Sandel on this. Or you could just Google trolley car ethics and you'll get lots of interesting stuff. There's a variant, believe it or not, that's called lifeboat ethics. But to get back to international politics, right, the question of World War II is one that non-perfectionists will point to as well. And some realists will point to this, which is prior to World War II, the leaders of Europe, especially France and Britain, were desperate to avoid another war. That was an ethical position. Everybody understood how bad World War I had been, and they wanted to stop it from happening again. And if there was any way to avoid World War II, they wanted to do it. But as a result of their pacifism and their trying to strike a deal with Hitler, the result, of course, was the slaughter of millions of innocents. And so the non-perfectionist perspective is going to be, that's not necessarily an ethical outcome, right? When you do the ethical thing and you get millions of people killed, ultimately that's not ethical, right? But the key point that gets to the thing that I think is hard for us to grasp about non-perfectionism is just because we are sometimes required to do unethical things, it doesn't make it ethical, right? And so this is what is sometimes called dirty hands morality. You've got to do bad things to prevent something even worse from happening. And I always thought that one of the things we see in a lot of American Western movies, especially the movies of the Clint Eastwood variety, is actually an exploration of this notion of dirty hands morality. When the bad guy, right, turns out to be sort of okay because he turns out to be the alternative to somebody who's even worse. Right? The gunfighter saves the day. So non-perfectionism applied. Right? What does it say about things like the bombing of Hiroshima? The classic argument about the bombing of Hiroshima is, yeah, we dropped a nuclear weapon on a Japanese city full of civilians, but more people would have died if we had had to invade Japan the old-fashioned way. We could debate about the counterfactual, but at least that's the argument. Guantanamo Bay. Most people agree it's wrong to have people in this legal sort of black hole that is Guantanamo Bay. On the other hand, it's how do we figure out an alternative to doing that without letting a bunch of terrorists potentially just go to do more terrorism? I've listed a couple of other examples there. Simply the idea that sometimes you have to do really nasty things to prevent even worse things from happening. I mentioned in the book drone attacks. Drone attacks and the doctrine that the United States has adopted to deal with drone attacks is kind of meant to have it both ways, which is to say, yeah, there's a lot of really disturbing implications of drone attacks, and so we need a policy that allows us to use the good effects or the positive effects for the United States of drone attacks while trying to minimize some of the obvious ethical pitfalls. The textbook also talks about the responsibility to protect. Most international ethics questions that we talk about are about what is prohibited. And what's interesting about R2P, as it's called, is this is a discussion about what's required. And so this discussion, which is really just happening in the last 20 years or so, is I think a real step, a new step or a new direction in this discussion of international ethics. So I think this is one that's worth watching for the future. Now, getting back to the question of how much does the real, how do things work in the real world? How much impact do ethics have? You know, a lot, the realists and a lot of others are going to say, let's face it, not much. But again, I would come back to the constructivist position, which is that, ethics, when ethics conflict with interests, ethics may not win out. But that ethics do help define interests, right? There are costs of being seen as unethical. There's external prestige. You're going to have less influence in the world if you're seen as being bad. The United States has seen some of that effect in recent years. But it's also one of the reasons why the United States probably still has more prestige and more influence than a country like China or Russia. But also internal morale. We saw this in the United States during the Vietnam War. The increasing perception within the United States that the conduct of the Vietnam War was unethical or immoral really severely eroded the U.S. ability to fight the war because people simply wouldn't support it anymore. So again, this is a conversation that we've really just scratched the surface of, but hopefully I've given you some idea of it.